again everyone, another video recording for you. This time, this video recording is just reminding you about the key features of advances in medical knowledge, which is the fourth unit that we did when we actually studied this. So here we go. Okay, so medical knowledge before the Middle Ages, it wasn't non-existent. And this is just a bit of context for you. For example, ancient Egypt, there were physicians, which are doctors, and even to this day, medical records have been found in tombs. So there's obviously some evidence of medical knowledge as far back as ancient Egyptian times. The ancient Greeks, they had places of healing called Asclepions. And there was a god of healing, so clearly there was medical knowledge thought back in those days. And the ancient Romans, well, they brought fresh water to their towns and cities. They understood the importance of hygiene. Now, a lot of this medical knowledge, however, was lost during a period of time called the Dark Ages, which is after the Romans left. There obviously is some writing which has been translated, and that eventually gets to Western Europe. So you do have some medical knowledge ideas coming through from ancient times. One of the key features that you need to be aware of is about Hippocrates, who was known as the father of medicine, and his understanding and medical knowledge, of course, was based on the four humours. And his importance today is still quite relevant because new doctors take something called a Hippocratic oath when they qualify. Then it's important to be aware of Galen. He sort of goes hand in hand in some ways with Hippocrates. He developed Hippocrates' ideas about the four humours. He suggested that it was important for the four humours to be kept in balance. As far as other medical knowledge was concerned, he produced work on how the human body worked, but he usually dissected animals. He did develop the idea that listening to someone's pulse was good for diagnosing illnesses. And Galen's work filtered through to Europe, and it became accepted as medical knowledge. So then where we're at the beginning of the Middle Ages or the medieval period is that the medical knowledge that existed at the time is very much based on the ideas of Galen. And the church accepted these ideas as well because they linked into the idea of God. Now, I've mentioned it already, but key medical knowledge in medieval times was based on the four humours. Again, I've already said Hippocrates came up with this idea that the four humours should be in correct proportion in the body to keep healthy. The four humours are reminded there: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm and blood. And this was a big piece of understanding in medieval times. Other medical medical knowledge that people had at the time, people trusted alchemists. Alchemists were sort of early chemists in some way. There's some evidence to suggest they discovered things like hydrochloric acid and nitric acid. People believed as well in astrology, how the star signs affected the working of the inner body. And the church encouraged people to pray for forgiveness for their sins to avoid illness. And the church even set up schools of medicine throughout Europe. So there was a massive influence from the church. Galen's method of dissection was very prominent, and all these ideas were supported by the church, and any other progress was held back as a result of the church. So you make the point in medieval times that any medical knowledge advancement was very limited. Progress was limited. Moving on to the early modern period, which in this case is the 16th and 17th century. It's also called the Renaissance period. This is a time of change. There are three developments in particular that you need to know about, or three individuals that you need to know about. So kind of if you're writing a 16 marker on this, you would be writing essentially a bit more than you normally would in the early modern period. By 1525, the only source of medical knowledge was still the work of Galen. But now in this time period, there would be challenges to the work of Galen. There were some advances such as the microscope. Ideas were able to spread more quickly because of the printing press, and as a result of this, the work of three men was put forwards. The first one is Andreas Vesalius, who's a 16th century professor of surgery. He did his own dissections on human bodies as well, and he published a book called The Fabric of the Human Body in 1543, and it challenged the ideas of Galen on what the anatomy of the human body looked like. Like I said, he was able to dissect human bodies, unlike Galen, who used animals only, so he definitely got more of an accurate insight into what the human body looked like. The second one is Ambrose Paré, another 16th century individual, in this case a surgeon, a battlefield surgeon. You'd probably call him perhaps a barber surgeon. And during a battle, he discovered a new way of treating wounds. Instead of cauterizing wounds, which is burning the skin to stop bleeding, he came up with a different idea. It was a mixture of egg yolk, turpentine and rose oil, and it seemed to help heal the battlefield wound. And he also developed the idea of ligatures, which are like stitches, to tie off wounds after amputation instead of cauterization. So this was a step forward in treatments. It was new medical knowledge. He also developed artificial limbs as well for people who'd lost their hands and legs, for example, in a war. And the final one, and if you notice, this guy is a mainly 17th century individual, again an important individual, and his big claim to fame was he discovered the blood pumped around the body, the circulation of blood in a kind of one-way system. This obviously put into question another of Galen's discoveries, because Galen believed that blood was kind of pumped from the liver, and this again challenged one of Galen's ideas, which was what was happening at this time period. He too published a book in 1628 on the motion of the heart. It challenged how much blood, that the body could not have too much blood. It challenged the idea of the four humours. It challenged the idea of bloodletting or using leeches as a treatment or even prevention. And therefore, there were quite moderate advances in the early modern period. Moving on to the 19th, and that should say 20th century here. This is kind of a bit of a typo here. The early 20th centuries that should come into. In the 19th century, you do have some huge and substantial elements of progress as a result of the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Louis Pasteur, you should know this, was the first person to discover links between germs and disease, germ theory. He also developed effective vaccines because of this new knowledge and understanding. Robert Koch, on the back of Pasteur's germ theory, took things a step further and discovered that there were particular germs were linked to particular diseases. This, of course, was able, to sort of things like confirm the work of John Snow. They were able to discover bacteria that cause all these kind of important diseases that had affected people, such as cholera, pneumonia. There'd been major killers at the time, and this could obviously lead to more vaccines as well. Him and his team developed techniques to stain bacteria so things could be seen perhaps more closely under a microscope, could stand out more, to push forward even more developments in all sorts of fields. This kind of opens up the whole science of bacteriology. And as to show here the importance of his work, Robert Koch did win a Nobel Peace Prize in Nobel Prize for Science in 1905. Just remember the name of Paul Ehrlich, who was a student of Robert Koch actually, and he developed some treatments for a disease called syphilis, which was a drug that was developed. Syphilis was a particularly widespread disease at the time. It was a sexually transmitted disease, and he developed the idea of a drug which was like a magic bullet that only targeted the disease itself and didn't harm the rest of the body. And this is something obviously that will be developed as time went on. So in the 19th century there was big breakthroughs which then would have a knock-on effect into the 20th century. And here we have the 20th century, and the main pieces of knowledge that you need to be aware of in this time period are really to do with scanning techniques. Again, scanning for illness and diseases provides doctors and surgeons with a whole host of ways of discovering what is wrong with someone, and then from there can come treatments and cures. X-rays were actually developed in 1895 by William Röntgen. Okay, here to photograph bones. but initial doses of radiation were high, leading to side effects. World War I, X-ray units were set up to check for bullets, and that allowed for quicker and safer surgery. And of course, linked into that is the work of Marie Curie. Different types of scanning techniques then you need to be aware of, such as ultrasound, the MRI scanner, and PET scans and CT scans. And you can see there some key information about each one. Finally, in the 20th century, you have again some huge breakthroughs with the discovery of DNA. In 1953, Crick, Watson and Franklin published a paper about DNA, and this of course set medicine and medical knowledge on a completely different pathway. There was a whole host of impacts with this. For example, it became possible to look at genetic diseases. It became possible to screen people for genetic diseases and to actually really branch out in a whole area of science and genetics. In 1990, the Human Genome Project was set up to get a complete blueprint of humans, and even research was done into cloning and copying cells. Something which, has caused controversy and can cause controversial questioning, but at the same time, it just shows how much medical knowledge had advanced by the 20th century.